what Trump said about "you started it," no, that's just, forgive me, bluster and idiocy.
Let's talk to Tim Marshall, former foreign correspondent and author of a number of hugely successful books on geopolitics, including The Power of Geography, Prisoners of Geography, The Future of Geography. He's got geography pretty much, done, frankly. Tim, good afternoon to you.
Hello, Jane.
Can we just start with where A.N. Wilson ended there? What do you think about what he said?
Ms. Corrie was correct that if the Americans had stood up the way they did in the example she gave of Kuwait, there might have been a different outcome. But I think Mr. Wilson is correct in that they're just not comparable. You know, one, you were talking about a tin pot dictator who was rolled over fairly easily. They were talking about, you know, possibly the second or third biggest military in the world with nuclear weapons. I mean, it wasn't an option, nor was there the obligation for the Americans to do that. And then Mr. Wilson is probably correct when he says that the Americans have just given it up now, and which of course will lead us to the negotiations which are now taking place, and whether they will or won't be successful. But what we feared, or some of us feared, is that Trump has indeed is in the process of pulling the rug from out underneath the country of Ukraine.
Right. So his view that it was always a proxy war between Russia and America and never really anything else, that seems incredibly crude. But is that essentially the truth?
Yes and no. No, in that it is, of course, a direct war between the two states. And I think it's safer to say it's a proxy war between NATO and the Russians, because the Europeans, in the first instance, led by Boris Johnson when he was Prime Minister, have put 50% of the effort in, and the Americans have put the other 50% in. So in that sense, I think it's a proxy war between NATO. Now, the problem has come 3 years on that if 50% of that help, both financial, political, and of course military, is going to disappear, are the Europeans in any shape to continue? And the answer simply is no. They're in no shape to put together a peacekeeping operation, and they're in no shape to keep helping economically and militarily Ukraine. What they have done over the past 3 years is done what we've done over the past 3 decades, which is to hide behind the Americans and just assume that they would forever pay for our defense. And finally, the scales have fallen from their eyes with that speech in Munich last week.
Yeah. And the Americans, quite frankly, they feel they've got bigger fish to fry. And so we're left to get on with it. Tony Abbott, the former Australian Prime Minister, was referenced there. And he has spoken out and he has said, in his view, that what Donald Trump said about Ukraine starting the war was simply not correct. But why is he, relatively speaking, quite a lone voice? Why aren't other voices speaking up and saying much the same thing?
Yeah, I mentioned Boris Johnson earlier. I was quite surprised at his reaction, where he sort of brushed it away. I mean, I know he had an invite to the inauguration last month, but he kind of brushed it away and said, "Oh, that's just Trump's rhetoric." I mean, it's deeply historically, factually incorrect to say that, but it's also, and I think this is the important point, and it's the one that Zelensky is making today, it is one of Putin's talking points. It is part of the Russian propaganda to portray the whole war in that, as if 170,000 Russian troops had not crossed the border that night 3 years ago and poured into the countryside and the towns and cities of Ukraine, killing people. You might as well argue that the Americans started the war with Japan in 1941 when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, because you can make a whole argument about the Americans had been cutting off supplies of rubber to Japan, which was true, but I hardly think anybody in America says that therefore America started this war. And it boils down to this: do the former republics of the Soviet Empire, and it was a Russian empire, they were imperial, are they entitled to have a sovereign state, or must they bow to Moscow as their sovereign? And it comes down to that. So it's deeply insulting. What Trump said. He also said Zelensky's on 4% approval ratings. That's nonsense.
Yeah.
He's around the high 30s, pretty much the same as Trump is.
Right. Well, the idea that the call for an election in Ukraine is a bit rich. We know that President Putin was re-elected handsomely, wasn't he, not so long ago? But that election was just a nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, he's getting up towards Kim Jong-il 99% territory. Yes, I mean, the classic Russian way under Putin for 20 years now has been pretend there's an opposition, create some small parties that say they're against you, and then let them fall away in order to portray yourself as a sort of quasi-democracy, and then just steamroll it. And again, this comes back to Zelensky's fear that there's a theory that Trump just believes whatever has been told to him by the last person that he spoke to. And given that he's only speaking to the Russians and not to the Ukrainians, this again is one of the Russian talking points. The Russians are saying Zelensky has no validity and they won't discuss things with him because he's not a legitimate president, because they are several months now, I think, past when they should have had an election. But the response comes, we are in the middle of a massive war. 7 million of the electorate are out of the country. Hundreds of thousands are on the front lines. Can you really have an election in those circumstances? I know we didn't between 39 and 45 in the last century. So again, this is one of the Kremlin's talking points that is now being promulgated by the American president. And I think it's another sign that together they are going to sell out Ukraine, which will then leave Ukraine with a very difficult decision. Will they be blackmailed into having to go along with much of whatever the Russians and the Americans cook up? Or do they just say, we're not having that, appeal to Europe, and then see what happens?
While you've been talking, I've just been having a look at exactly what the former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said about Donald Trump's claim that Ukraine started the war. He said the president's remarks are not intended to be historically accurate, but to shock Europeans into action. Possibly right?
I don't buy that. I would absolutely buy that when Pete Hegseth, the US Defence Secretary, went to Brussels last week and said, you're on your own, more or less, and definitely start paying for your own defence. And then it was pretty much repeated by who went to the Munich Security? Was it Rubio? No, it was the Vice President Vance.
Yeah.
Thanks, yeah. That was absolutely intended to shock the Europeans, including the British, out of this complacency and this posturing that they've been doing for decades now, and primarily in the last 3 years, standing behind their podiums, sonorous voices saying, we will stand by Ukraine. Well, go on then. And that was intended to shock them. But what Trump said about you started it, no, that's just, forgive me, bluster and idiocy.
Yeah, get off the fence, Tim. That's what we like.
I am on the fence most of the time because I do try to be fair to both sides, and including the Americans. I think they have a very, very strong argument about no longer having to pay for our defence. Yeah, very strong argument. But the manner in which they're going about it, I think we are in an era now, which is epoch making. And I know people always say, oh, we're at the crossroads of history, and it's very rarely true. I think it is now. We are either going to re-energize NATO with a strong European component, or we're heading towards the end of NATO and Europe having to defend itself without having the will to tax people to do it.
What about Nigel Farage? I don't recall him saying very much about what's been happening and who's been saying what this week. But can you think of anything?
No, well, Farage is interesting on this because, he's clearly, obviously, pro-Trump, pro-America, and takes a dim view of the whole war and is not sure how much we should be involved in it. Nevertheless, he's actually been slightly behind the other two names in the Reform Party, They've gone further out in favour of Trump. I think it's possible Mr. Farage is a little concerned about the prospect of the transatlantic alliance falling apart and us being on our own. I mean, we are 30 years behind. We have a hollowed out military. It's the same across Europe. We don't have enough 155 millimeter shells to fight a war for more than a few weeks. The British would really struggle to put 10,000 troops into Ukraine. I mean, that's where we are now. We went for rapid reaction forces, small, nimble, agile, that could deploy to Kuwait, to the Sahel, that could deploy to Syria or Iraq. And we completely forgot about home.